We try to make sure we give them the security and the safety that they need. And we're a very open family, so we talk about things that bother us and things that trouble us. But you never quite know the knock-on effects it can have.
Are you optimistic?
I am optimistic. I'm generally a very optimistic person, especially when I'm with someone like you.
The palace tried to keep it secret for years, but at midnight they had no choice. The statement about Prince Louis was only 2 sentences long, yet it shattered every assumption about his future. What royal insiders discovered about the young prince was so unexpected, so unprecedented, that it forced the monarchy to do something it had never done in 1,000 years.
A loving home ultimately teaches us how to love and how to care. But every environment has the potential to shape our hearts. Every one of you interacts with your own environment: a home, a family, a business, a workforce, a community. These are the ecosystems that you yourselves help to weave.
By morning, the world would know the truth they'd been hiding, and nothing about the royal family would ever be the same again. The statement itself was remarkably short. It confirmed that Prince Louis, the youngest child of the Prince and Princess of Wales, would be stepping back from the traditional expectations placed on royal children in his position. The wording was careful, almost deliberately vague. It mentioned health considerations, the need for a different approach to his future role, and the family's commitment to his well-being. What it didn't do was explain why. That absence of detail became the story itself. For those who had followed the young prince's public appearances over the years, the announcement wasn't entirely shocking. There had been signs, though most people hadn't recognized them as such at the time. Louis had always been the most unpredictable of the Wales children during public events. He was the one who made faces during the Platinum Jubilee, who covered his ears when the planes flew too low, who sometimes looked like he wanted to be anywhere but on that balcony. The public found it endearing. They saw a child being a child, bringing a touch of authenticity to the carefully managed world of royal protocol. But looking back, those moments revealed something more significant. They weren't just about a playful personality or a shorter attention span. They were glimpses of a child who processed the world differently, who found the sensory overload of public life genuinely difficult to manage. The noise, the crowds, the constant attention, all of it took a toll that wasn't immediately visible to those watching from a distance. Prince Louis was born in April 2018, the third child in a family that had already captured global attention. His arrival was covered extensively by media outlets around the world, with photographers camping outside the hospital for days. From his very first public appearance, wrapped in a white blanket on the steps of the Lindo wing, he became part of a narrative much larger than himself. He was the spare to the spare, fifth in line to the throne, a position that came with its own peculiar set of expectations and contradictions. In his earliest years, Louis seemed to thrive in the domestic sphere. Reports from palace insiders, though always filtered through official channels, painted a picture of a happy, energetic child. He loved being outdoors, playing in the gardens at Kensington Palace and later at their country home in Norfolk. He was close to his siblings, particularly Charlotte, who seemed to take on a protective role, even though she was only slightly older. George, as the future king, had a different kind of relationship with him, one that mixed typical sibling dynamics with an awareness of their different positions within the family structure. But even in those early years, there were subtle differences in how Louis engaged with the world. His parents noticed them first, as parents do. He needed more downtime after busy days. He sometimes became overwhelmed in situations that his siblings handled more easily. He gravitated toward quieter activities, showing an unusual level of focus for a young child when looking at books or exploring the palace's extensive art collection. None of this seemed concerning at the time. Children develop at different rates after all, and personalities vary widely even within the same family. The royal household has access to some of the best pediatric specialists in the country, and Louis received regular developmental assessments, as all royal children do. These weren't prompted by specific concerns initially, but rather were part of standard protocol. Over time, however, the medical team began documenting patterns. Louis showed what they called heightened sensitivity to sensory input. He tired more quickly during events that required sustained attention and composure. His recovery time after public engagements was notably longer than expected for a child his age. The terminology used in these assessments was always careful, no one wanted to label a young child or create unnecessary alarm. The doctors spoke about individual differences in processing, about the need to respect each child's unique neurological makeup, about the importance of not forcing a particular developmental trajectory. What they were describing, though they didn't always use these exact terms, was a child whose nervous system responded differently to the demands being placed on it. Public appearances became a carefully managed aspect of Louis's life. Unlike his siblings, whose schedule of engagements gradually increased as they grew older, Louis's appearances remained sporadic and brief. Palace officials explained this as a natural consequence of his age and position in the line of succession, which was partially true, but it was also a deliberate strategy to protect him from situations that the family and medical team knew would be challenging for him. The public saw him at major events like Trooping the Colour, the annual celebration of the monarch's official birthday, and during significant family moments like the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II and the coronation of King Charles III. Each time he captured attention. Sometimes it was because of his obvious discomfort, other times because of moments of genuine joy that broke through the formality. People commented on how he seemed to struggle with the length of ceremonies, how he often appeared ready to leave long before the event concluded, how he sometimes needed gentle guidance from his mother or siblings to maintain composure. What the cameras didn't capture were the hours afterward. The way he would retreat to his room and need time alone to decompress. The way certain sounds or bright lights would continue to bother him long after an event ended. The way he sometimes struggled to transition back to normal family life after being in the public eye. His parents became adept at reading the signs, at knowing when to step in and when to give him space, at managing his schedule in ways that minimize stress while still fulfilling basic expectations. Behind palace walls, conversations about Louis's future began much earlier than anyone outside the family knew. These weren't crisis meetings or emergency consultations. They were thoughtful, ongoing discussions among people who genuinely cared about his well-being. The family's approach was always to see him first as Louis, not as a prince with predetermined duties. They wanted to understand what he needed, what brought him joy, what felt natural to him, rather than simply molding him to fit traditional expectations. The palace staff who worked most closely with the family became protective of Louis in ways that went beyond their professional duties. They adjusted routines without being asked, created quiet spaces where he could retreat, learn to recognize when he was reaching his limit. His teachers tailored his education to his strengths, focusing on areas where he showed genuine interest rather than rigidly adhering to curriculum designed for future working royals. This flexibility wasn't officially documented or announced. It simply became the way things were done. As Louis grew older, the palace began to understand that the informal accommodations made during his early childhood would need to become more structured. The transition into what might be called the preparatory years for any royal child typically involves a gradual increase in responsibility and public visibility. For children in direct line to the Horsaucent throne, this process is well established, refined over generations. For those further down the succession line, there's theoretically more flexibility, but certain baseline expectations still exist. Louis was reaching the age where those expectations would naturally begin to apply. The initial plan was relatively modest. There would be no immediate push toward full public duties, but rather a gentle introduction to the kinds of activities he might eventually undertake. This included educational sessions about constitutional history, basic diplomatic protocol, and the kinds of soft skills needed for public engagement. The approach was meant to be age-appropriate and sensitive to what the family already knew about his needs. Nobody was suggesting he needed to be ready for solo engagements or major speeches. The goal was simply to begin building a foundation. Louis approached these new lessons with the same conscientiousness he brought to most things. His tutors consistently reported that he was intelligent and engaged. He had a particular gift for understanding complex concepts when they were presented in the right way. History fascinated him, especially when it was taught through primary sources rather than dry textbook summaries. He could spend hours examining old documents or artifacts, asking thoughtful questions about context and meaning. His memory for details was exceptional, and he had an instinctive sense of how different historical periods connected to one another. But these sessions also revealed the ongoing challenges. While Louis excelled in one-on-one or small group settings, anything that simulated a public environment proved more difficult. The palace began organizing what they called practice engagements, low-stakes situations where Louis could try out the kinds of interactions he might eventually need to perform in public. Staff members would role-play as members of the public or officials he might meet. The setting would be kept as comfortable as possible, usually within familiar palace rooms rather than external locations. During these practice sessions, Louis would start strong. He had learned the appropriate greetings, the right way to shake hands, the kinds of questions to ask, to show interest without being intrusive. He understood the theory of public engagement quite well, but as the sessions continued, usually after about 15 or 20 minutes, his energy would visibly decline. His responses would become shorter, less spontaneous. His posture would shift as he tried to maintain composure despite growing fatigue. By the end, even sessions that lasted only half an hour, he would need significant time to recover. The medical team continued their assessments throughout this period. They conducted various tests and evaluations, always with Louis's comfort as the priority. What they found was consistent with their earlier observations but became more pronounced as the demands increased. Louis wasn't dealing with a specific medical condition that could be easily diagnosed or treated. Instead, he had what some specialists described as a significantly lower threshold for the kind of sustained social performance that public life requires. His nervous system simply processed these situations as more taxing than most people would experience them. One neurologist who consulted with the palace team explained it in terms that helped the family understand what Louis was experiencing. For most people, even those who don't particularly enjoy public speaking or formal events, there's a kind of autopilot that can engage after initial nervousness fades. The performance becomes manageable, even routine, because the brain develops efficient pathways for handling these repeated situations. For Louis, that autopilot never fully engaged. Each public interaction required the same level of conscious effort and energy expenditure as the first one. There was no adaptation, no growing ease with repetition. Every engagement felt, neurologically speaking, like starting from scratch. This meant that what might be mildly tiring for another child his age was genuinely exhausting for Louis. It wasn't a matter of building stamina through practice or developing confidence through exposure. The fundamental way his brain processed these situations was different, and no amount of preparation or practice was going to change that basic reality. The doctors were careful to emphasize that this wasn't a failing or a weakness. It was simply a characteristic of how he was wired, as intrinsic to him as his eye color or his height. The palace faced a dilemma that had no clear precedent. Royal children had certainly struggled with various aspects of public life throughout history. There were examples of those who preferred privacy, who found certain duties challenging, who chafed against the restrictions of their position. But the institution had always operated on the assumption that with proper training and support, any royal daciate could fulfill at least a basic level of public duty. The idea that someone might be fundamentally unsuited to this life, not through choice but through inherent capacity, was difficult to reconcile with centuries of tradition. Discussions about Louis's future began to take place at higher levels of palace administration. These conversations involved not just family members and medical professionals, but constitutional experts, senior advisors, and representatives from various royal households. Everyone involved was working with the best intentions, genuinely trying to find a path forward that would serve both Louis's well-being and the institution's needs. But good intentions didn't make the problem any simpler to solve. Some advisors argued for pushing forward with the original plan, perhaps at a slower pace or with additional support. They worried that stepping back too much would set a precedent that could weaken the monarchy's public presence. Others countered that forcing a child into a role he was clearly struggling with would be both cruel and ultimately ineffective. If Louis couldn't comfortably fulfill basic duties now, how could he possibly manage them as an adult when expectations would be even higher? There was also the question of public perception. The monarchy's relationship with the British public had evolved significantly in recent decades, with increasing emphasis on relatability and emotional openness. Mental health awareness had become a major focus of William and Catherine's charitable work. They had spoken publicly about the importance of supporting children's emotional well-being and not forcing them into situations that caused genuine distress. How could they reconcile that public message with privately insisting their own son push through difficulties that were clearly taking a toll? Throughout all of these adult discussions and debates, Louis continued with his daily life. He attended his lessons, spent time with his siblings, and pursued his own interests. He was aware that adults were concerned about his future, though he probably didn't grasp the full extent of the institutional hand-wringing happening on his behalf. His parents tried to shield him from the weight of these decisions while also being honest with him about the challenges he faced. What became increasingly clear to those working most closely with Louis was that he had genuine strengths that weren't being fully recognized in the narrow context of traditional royal duties. His deep engagement with historical materials wasn't just a pleasant hobby. He had a natural aptitude for archival work, for handling delicate objects with appropriate care, for understanding the significance of preservation and documentation. He asked questions that revealed an intuitive grasp of how physical objects carry meaning across time. Palace archivists who occasionally worked with him were consistently impressed by his careful attention and genuine curiosity. He also showed remarkable empathy in one-on-one interactions. Without the pressure of public performance, Louis was warm and thoughtful in his relationships with staff and family members. He noticed when people were having difficult days, remembered details they had shared in previous conversations, and showed a maturity beyond his years in how he related to others privately. These qualities would theoretically serve him well in public life, but the problem was that he couldn't access them reliably when under the stress of public scrutiny. The gap between Louis's private capabilities and his public struggles became the central challenge facing the palace. He wasn't lacking in intelligence, compassion, or dedication. He simply couldn't perform these qualities in the specific context that royal life demanded. It was like having a gifted musician who couldn't play in front of audiences, or a brilliant writer who froze when asked to give readings. The talent was real, but the format was wrong. As months passed and Louis approached his preteen years, the palace had to confront an uncomfortable truth. The accommodations they had been making weren't temporary measures until he grew into his role. They were becoming permanent features of how Louis needed to live his life. The question was no longer whether he would eventually be ready for traditional royal duties. The question was whether those duties should remain the expectation at all. Despite the challenges Louis faced behind palace walls, the public continued to see him as one of the most endearing members of the royal family. His appearances, though increasingly rare, generated enormous affection. Social media would light up with commentary whenever he appeared at major events. People loved his authenticity, the way he seemed unfiltered compared to the more polished presentations of other royals. When he made a funny face during a solemn ceremony or appeared bored during a long parade, the public found it refreshing rather than disrespectful. What the public interpreted as charming spontaneity was often something quite different. Those funny faces sometimes reflected genuine sensory discomfort. The boredom wasn't just typical childish restlessness, but a sign that he was reaching the limits of what he could comfortably endure. The moments that went viral as cute or relatable were often followed by hours of private recovery that nobody saw or discussed publicly. The gap between public perception and private reality had grown so wide that it had become almost unbridgeable. The palace staff developed increasingly sophisticated strategies for managing Louis's public appearances. Schedules would be planned with military precision, accounting for everything from the duration of his presence to his exact positioning relative to crowds and noise sources. Events were selected carefully, with preference given to those that would be shorter or less overwhelming. His siblings, particularly Charlotte, had developed an intuitive understanding of when Louis was struggling and would subtly adjust their own behavior to provide cover or distraction. George, as the eldest and most aware of the family's public role, took on a protective stance that went beyond typical sibling dynamics. During the period following Queen Elizabeth's death and the subsequent funeral proceedings, George was often observed staying close to Louis, creating a physical buffer between his younger brother and the intensity of the moment. These weren't actions anyone had explicitly asked him to take. He simply understood that Louis needed support, and he provided it naturally. Charlotte's role was perhaps even more nuanced. She had a gift for reading Louis's emotional state and would engage him in quiet conversation during long events, giving him something to focus on besides the overwhelming environment. She would sometimes create small disruptions or moments of levity that gave him mental breaks without drawing negative attention. To observers, these just looked like normal sibling interactions. Within the family, they were recognized as essential coping mechanisms that made Louis's public appearances possible at all. But even with all these accommodations and support systems, it was becoming clear that the current approach couldn't continue indefinitely. Louis was getting older and the expectations for his public role were theoretically supposed to increase, not remain static or decrease. There were events where his presence was considered important for family unity or constitutional reasons. The palace was running out of ways to explain his limited visibility without raising questions about why a seemingly healthy young prince was so rarely seen. Behind closed doors, the discussions about Louis's future intensified. These meetings took place in various palace offices and conference rooms, involving an expanding circle of people as the implications of any decision became clearer. The conversations weren't hostile or combative, but they were increasingly urgent. Something had to change, and soon. The question was what that change would look like and how it would be communicated to a public that had no real understanding of the situation. The medical team presented their findings in increasingly stark terms. They had years of documentation showing consistent patterns. Louis's difficulties weren't improving with age or experience. If anything, as he matured and became more aware of expectations, the psychological stress was adding another layer to the existing physiological challenges. They recommended a significant reduction in public duties, potentially a complete withdrawal from the traditional path expected of a working royal. The language they used was clinical, but the message was clear. Continuing on the current trajectory risked genuine harm to Louis's long-term well-being. Constitutional experts weighed in with their own concerns. While there was no legal requirement for Louis to perform public duties at his age, there were traditions and expectations that had held for generations. More importantly, there were questions about precedent. If one royal child could be excused from public life due to personal challenges, what would that mean for others in the future? Would it weaken the institution's ability to maintain its public presence? These weren't questions asked with hostility toward Louis, but they were genuine concerns about the broader implications. The family's private discussions were perhaps the most difficult. William and Catherine had to balance their roles as parents with their positions within the institution. They knew what was best for their son as individuals, but they also carried responsibility for the monarchy's future. Charles, now king, brought his own perspective shaped by decades of navigating similar tensions between personal needs and public duty. He was sympathetic to Louis's struggles in ways that perhaps earlier generations of royals might not have been, given his own well-documented difficulties with certain aspects of royal life. What made the situation particularly complex was that nobody was suggesting Louis was incapable or unworthy. Everyone involved recognized his intelligence, his sensitivity, and his potential to contribute meaningfully in the right context. The problem was that the traditional context of royal duty didn't appear to be the right one for him. Finding an alternative path required creativity and courage, a willingness to challenge assumptions that had held for centuries. As these discussions continued through various levels of palace administration, the decision was gradually becoming clear. The question shifted from whether Louis would step back from traditional expectations to how that step back would be managed and communicated. The palace began preparing various versions of an announcement, workshopping language that would be honest without being alarmist, that would protect Louis's privacy while satisfying public curiosity, that would present the change as positive rather than tragic. The night they finally released the statement, the palace was unusually quiet. Staff who normally would have gone home for the evening lingered, aware that something significant was happening even if they didn't know all the details. The statement went out just after midnight, a timing chosen to give morning news programs time to prepare their coverage but to avoid the immediate frenzy of a daytime announcement. The wording had been refined through countless drafts, every phrase carefully considered for its potential interpretations. The response was immediate and multifaceted. News organizations scrambled to understand what the announcement meant and why it was being made. Some outlets speculated about serious illness, despite the statement's careful language indicating this wasn't the primary issue. Others focused on the unprecedented nature of a young royal essentially being removed from the line of duty, even if he remained in the line of succession. Social media is filled with theories, concerns, and expressions of support. Within the palace, the family gathered in private quarters away from staff and official business. This was one of those rare moments when the institution fell away, and they were simply a family dealing with a difficult situation together. Louis understood more than some might have expected. He had been involved in age-appropriate discussions about his future and knew that changes were coming. But understanding something intellectually and experiencing the reality of it are very different things. He asked the question that would later be reported by palace insiders who were present that evening. He wanted to know if stepping away from public duties meant he would be forgotten, if history would consider him unimportant because he wasn't in the spotlight. It was the kind of question that revealed both his maturity and his vulnerability. He understood enough about how royalty worked to know that visibility and significance were often linked in the public mind. The fear of irrelevance, of disappointing people, of being seen as somehow less than. These were concerns he had been carrying silently. His father's response, though never officially recorded, was described by those present as one of the most emotionally significant moments in the entire process. Rather than offering empty reassurance or trying to minimize Louis's concerns, he acknowledged them as valid while offering a different perspective. Not everyone who matters is visible, he explained. Not everyone who contributes does so from a balcony or during a parade. There are many ways to serve, many forms of significance that don't require constant public presence. The following days were difficult for everyone involved. The palace had to manage public relations while also supporting a child processing a major life change. Staff members who had worked with Louis over the years felt a mix of relief that he would be protected from duties that were clearly harming him and sadness that the situation had reached this point. Family members dealt with their own complicated emotions, glad that a decision had finally been made, but uncertain about what came next. What nobody fully anticipated was how the public would ultimately respond once the initial shock faded. The outpouring of support was genuine and widespread. People shared their own stories of children or family members who didn't fit conventional expectations, who needed different paths than the ones laid out for them. The decision was increasingly framed not as a failure, but as a compassionate choice that prioritized a child's well-being over institutional tradition. In the weeks following the announcement, while the public tried to make sense of what Prince Louis's future would look like, the palace was quietly working on something that had no real precedent in modern royal history. They were attempting to create a role that honored both tradition and individual capability, something that would give Louis purpose and meaning without subjecting him to the demands that had proven so difficult. The challenge was finding something substantial enough to be respected, but different enough to accommodate his specific needs. The answer had been there all along, visible to anyone who had paid attention to where Louis naturally gravitated when given freedom to choose. From his earliest years, he had shown an unusual connection to historical objects and spaces. While other children might run through palace corridors focused on play, Louis would stop to examine portraits or ask questions about the age of furniture. He treated old books with a reverence that seemed instinctive rather than taught. Staff members in the royal collection had noticed his careful attention during the few occasions when he had been allowed into restricted areas of the archives. What made this more than just a childhood interest was the depth of his engagement. Louis didn't just like old things in an aesthetic sense. He seemed to understand intuitively that these objects were vessels of memory, that they connected present to past in ways that mattered beyond their material value. When he held a centuries-old document, he did so with an awareness of its fragility and significance that normally took years of training to develop. Archivists who had spent decades working with historical materials recognized something genuine in his approach. The idea of positioning Louis as a guardian of royal heritage emerged gradually from various conversations. It wasn't a single person's brainstorm, but rather a collective realization that grew from observing what Louis naturally did well. Someone mentioned his comfort in archival spaces. Another person noted his genuine interest in conservation. A third pointed out that the royal collection, one of the most significant cultural holdings in the world, could benefit from having a dedicated royal patron who truly understood its importance rather than just lending their name to fundraising efforts. The more the idea was discussed, the more sense it made. The Royal Collection and associated archives represent an extraordinary repository of British history. There are millions of items spanning centuries, from priceless artworks to mundane administrative records that nonetheless tell important stories about how the nation was governed and how people lived. Managing and preserving this collection is serious work, requiring expertise, dedication, and resources. It also happens to be work that can be done largely away from public scrutiny, in quiet spaces where Louis's sensitivities wouldn't be constantly triggered. What made the role more than just a convenient solution was that it represented genuine contribution. The Royal Collection isn't just a museum for tourists. It's an active research resource used by historians, an educational tool, and a living connection to national heritage. Having a member of the royal family deeply invested in its preservation and accessibility would add value beyond public relations. Louis wouldn't just be kept busy with work projects, he would be developing real expertise in an area that genuinely mattered. The king understood this perhaps better than anyone else in the family. His own relationship with history and heritage had always been more scholarly than some of his relatives. He had long advocated for preservation of historic buildings and traditional crafts, often facing criticism for being too focused on the past. He recognized in Louis a similar temperament, someone who found meaning in continuity and memory rather than in the immediate spectacle of public performance. The role they were creating for Louis wasn't a consolation prize. It was an alignment of the boy with work that suited who he actually was. The formal introduction to this new path happened without cameras or public fanfare. It took place in one of the palace's archival rooms, a space that most visitors never see and many staff members rarely enter. The room itself was remarkable, filled with carefully controlled temperature and humidity to protect its contents. Shelves lined the walls, holding bound volumes and document boxes that contained everything from medieval charters to recent administrative records. The lighting was soft, designed to minimize damage to light-sensitive materials while still allowing for detailed examination. Louis entered the space with his family and a small group of archivists and collection managers. He had been in similar rooms before during informal visits, but this was different. This was the beginning of something official, the first step toward a role that would define much of his future. The head archivist, a woman who had spent 40 years working with the royal collection, greeted him with genuine warmth. She didn't treat him like a child being humoured or a prince being managed. She spoke to him as someone entering a field of serious scholarship, acknowledging both his youth and his potential. She showed him some of the collection's most significant items, explaining not just their historical importance, but the practical challenges of preserving them. There were documents whose ink was fading despite best efforts at conservation, textiles that were deteriorating in ways that modern science was still trying to fully understand, photographs from early royal tours that were becoming brittle with age. Each item represented not just history, but an ongoing battle against time and entropy. The work of preservation was never finished, never perfect, always requiring judgment calls about how to balance access with protection. Louis listened with complete attention, asking questions that revealed he was already thinking beyond the surface level. He wanted to know how decisions were made about which items to prioritize for conservation when resources were limited. He asked about the ethics of restoration, whether it was better to stabilize something in its current deteriorated state or try to return it to its original appearance. These were questions that practicing archivists wrestled with regularly, not the kinds of things most people thought to ask during an introductory tour. His father watched this exchange with visible emotion. There's a particular kind of recognition that happens when you see your child finding their place in the world, discovering work that resonates with who they are rather than who others expect them to be. The king had spent his own life navigating between duty and inclination, often having to suppress his genuine interests in favor of what was expected. Watching Louis begin a path where those two things aligned must have felt like a kind of redemption, a sign that the institution could evolve to accommodate different ways of contributing. The following months involved a gradual, carefully paced introduction to the real work of heritage preservation. Louis wasn't immediately given responsibility for anything critical. Instead, he learned foundational skills under the guidance of experienced professionals. He studied proper handling techniques for fragile materials, learning how temperature changes from human hands could damage certain types of paper or fabric. He practiced cataloging methods, understanding how proper documentation made historical materials useful for research rather than just preserved for storage. What surprised many of the professionals working with him was how naturally he took to the meticulous, detail-oriented nature of the work. Archival preservation requires patience and precision, qualities that don't always come easily to young people. Louis seemed to have an innate understanding that rushing could cause irreversible damage, that some tasks simply required slow, careful attention, regardless of how tedious they might seem. His supervisors noted that he rarely showed the frustration or impatience they often saw in trainees when faced with repetitive or exacting work. The public learned about this new direction through carefully managed communications over time rather than a single grand announcement. The palace released images of Louis working with archivists, studying historical documents, and participating in conservation projects. The messaging emphasized that this was meaningful work, not a ceremonial role or a way to keep him occupied. News outlets generally responded positively, with many commentators noting that it represented a modern approach to royal service, one that valued different forms of contribution rather than insisting everyone fit the same mold. There were critics, of course. Some traditionalists argued that withdrawing from public duties set a dangerous precedent, that it weakened the monarchy's visible presence in national life. Others suggested that focusing on archives was too obscure, that Louis would fade from public consciousness if he wasn't regularly appearing at ceremonies and events. These criticisms were noted but ultimately didn't change the fundamental direction that had been chosen. The decision had been made with Louis's well-being as the priority, and the family wasn't going to reverse course based on external pressure. As spring arrived and the immediate crisis atmosphere faded, a new normal began to establish itself. Louis continued his education while also spending increasing amounts of time in archival and collection spaces. He developed relationships with conservators and historians, learning from people who had dedicated their careers to preservation work. He began to contribute in small but meaningful ways, helping to catalogue previously unorganized materials, assisting with inventory projects, even offering insights during discussions about how to make the collection more accessible to researchers and the public. The transformation wasn't dramatic because it didn't need to be. Louis hadn't changed into a different person. He had simply found a context where who he already was could flourish rather than struggle. The qualities that made public performance difficult, his sensitivity, his need for quiet, his preference for depth over breadth, these were assets in archival work. The careful attention to detail, the patience with slow processes, the genuine respect for historical materials, all of it aligned with the work he was now learning to do. His siblings remained supportive in their own ways. Charlotte and George understood that Louis's path would be different from theirs, but that difference didn't diminish his importance within the family or his contribution to the family's broader purpose. They visited him sometimes in the archival spaces, showing genuine interest in what he was learning and doing. These private family moments, away from cameras and public scrutiny, allowed them to maintain normal sibling relationships despite their diverging public roles. The story of Prince Louis stepping away from traditional expectations and toward heritage preservation work became, in time, less about what he couldn't do and more about what he could. It became a narrative about institutional adaptation, about recognizing that service takes many forms, about valuing authenticity over conformity. The monarchy had faced this challenge and responded with flexibility and compassion, prioritizing a child's well-being while still finding meaningful purpose for him within the broader royal framework. Whether this would prove to be an isolated case or the beginning of more fundamental changes in how royal roles were conceived remained to be seen, but for Louis himself, the immediate question had been answered. He had found his place, not in the spotlight, but in the careful, quiet work of preserving the memory that made the spotlight meaningful.